All right, starting the recording right now. And this is the LEQ review and information chat prior to your first LEQ tomorrow. A couple of things about the LEQ tomorrow logistically. Number one, you have the entirety of the class period. Number two, as soon as you come in, so you're going to see on the table by the door, you're going to see lined paper and the rubric that looks just like this rubric from Tom Ritchie that we are using, shout out Tom Ritchie, to grade these. And then what you'll see is the LEQ question up on the board using the PowerPoint. Now, unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to make it in tomorrow. I have to call in sick, but the instructions for logging back into the board if the substitute teacher should be having trouble getting back in, I'm going to pull it up in the morning before anybody gets there, make sure it's all ready to go. But if they're having trouble logging in, the instructions for logging in are on the back of the keyboard, the Promethean board keyboard. And so hopefully you can help them log back in. The PowerPoint will be already pulled up and just needs the teacher to click on it. Okay. You have the entirety of the class period. When you're done, you're going to hand in lined paper with your rubric on top. Hopefully you remember to put your name on there too. And we don't want it stapled. Just as a heads up, we do not want these stapled, and they'll just be turned back in to the teacher. Okay, that's the first thing. Let's talk questions that you have about that information, or any broad questions about the LEQ before I jump into the rubric once again. Not seeing anything, I'm just going to chime in and go back over the rubric very, very briefly here because you've already seen so many of these things before. Number one, contextualization. I don't think anything more needs to be said about this point, but as a reminder, this is not an introduction to the topic. This is about, okay, this event here that we are discussing is at this point in history. What is happening around that point in history that would help us to get a better understanding of the broader view of that time period? So for example, if the question was about, I don't know, the Renaissance, understanding medieval Europe and the Black Death might help us to gain a better understanding of the Renaissance. We're looking for 2 to 4 sentences, maybe 3 to 4 sentences, but no more than 4 or 5 sentences max in order to do this. And it's made up of 3 different pieces. A broad trend of what is happening in this time period, the specific example, and when I say that, it needs to be a specific thing that happened that would indicate that particular trend. So if we're talking about the Black Death, we might talk specifically about the elimination of jobs in the lower half of the feudal hierarchy, which leads to a further emphasis on the labor of those people. Okay, it has to be something that we can point to specifically and say, this is a thing that happened, not just a broad description. And then finally, a connection to the theme of this. Because of the changes made to society as a result of the Black Death, this is going to have far-reaching consequences for the people of the Renaissance and lead to blah, 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 whatever. Okay, thesis claim, again, standard. Now, one difference with the LEQ thesis that I would say is you don't always need to have a 2-point thesis. I like to recommend it, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that way because You only need 2 specific examples in order to earn the point for description. And I think that a singular specific thesis could work. And I'll explain some variations of that in just a minute. The second section here, evidence and support for argument. This is what you've been doing your entire lives when it comes to creating an essay. Give us 2 specific historic examples that are going to illustrate your thesis, or excuse me, 2 specific historic examples that are just relevant to the topic of the prompt. That's it to earn that first point. That's really easy. You kids can do that in your sleep, okay? And then the secondary piece of it is that explanation piece, using those pieces of evidence to support an argument that you are making. And again, I'll explain the difference between those 2 things as we go. Then we have analysis and reasoning. And again, that first point there, you have to earn that one to earn the second one. But to me, the type of question that it is going to dictate which of those historical reasoning skills you're going to use. If it's going to ask you to, it's going to give you 2 different time periods, then you're probably looking at compare or contrast, or continuity and change over time. It's going to tell you what to use, but you have to frame the essay as that. You have to use the information in your essay to show that, not just that, hey, here are the things I know. And then finally, complex understanding, which, as we all know, is all kinds of fun. Okay, questions on the rubric? Anyone's parents listening in tonight? Want to join the chat? Come hang. Ava, tell your parents I said hello.
You are absolutely right. All we have to do is get through the next few days with my crazy ex-wife. What do you say? No.
You know, you can unmute yourself, and I think that would probably take less time.
Yeah, probably, but I'm at dance, so it's really loud.
Shout out Studio 19. Example of historical reasoning. So what do you mean by that? You want me to go over one? Is that what you're saying? Whomever that's from? Okay. In terms of how to frame the essay. All right, I'll talk about that in just a second. Okay. Let's see here. So let's look at an essay. I think that's going to be the easiest thing, to be perfectly honest with you. And so we're just going to go here, make our little text box, and we're going to paste this in. And here we go. That's great. Okay. Evaluate the most significant effect of the printing press during the period of 1450 to 1650. There are a couple of things that should draw your attention. Number one, evaluate. You need to make some sort of judgment. Okay. Number two, the most significant effect. That is singular, my friends. So you only need one that you're going to identify as the most significant. And in there, the effect of it. So it's not about what the printing press is, it's about an effect of the printing press. Okay. And then the last thing you want to make sure you pay attention to is the date range. Okay. If it says centuries, please write out the dates. That's going to be super important for you. Okay. So that's the prompt. Cool. This is a former LEQ prompt. So just to give you a heads up, this is really strongly tied to what we're going to be asked to do. All right. To me, I think there are really 2 things that I would look at as I examine this question and say, okay, these are, and I'm going to post that in the chat too, just so that we can keep coming back to it here. 2 things that I think are the most significant are the influence on the Protestant Reformation and the influence on the scientific revolution. But there are a multitude of other ways that you could go with this. So I might say something like the most significant effect of the printing press is the ability to distribute information to people across classes of society, as shown through the Protestant Reformation. So I've given you a claim, I've given you my significant effect, and I've told you a line of reasoning as to why that is the case using the Protestant Reformation to do so. Okay. I think you could use SciRev. I think you could use, anything. You could even just use the concept of the ability to get information to people of all walks of life, because now the lower classes will have more access to information. Whatever it is, you just need to make sure that you make a claim and you have a line of reasoning behind it. Okay. What I do as I try to plan this out, evaluate the most significant effect. Okay, I'm going to say the effect is info to lower to what, maybe just make it all citizens or all people or something like that. And I'm just going to write down my claim. I have my line of reasoning. My line of reasoning is going to be specific to the Protestant Reformation. Okay. So now I have each of those things. I have my thesis statement set up. Now I'm going to do the other parts of the rubric. So I'm going to make sure that I contextualize. I think that is the next piece of this, because to me, these two things are free points. Okay. And the way that I'm going to try to contextualize this, again, I could do this in any number of ways. So actually, why don't we do this? Throw in some things into the chat that you think you could use to help you to contextualize. Go ahead. What do you think? Into the chat. What are some things you could use to help with contextualization? Go. So a lot of people are going the religious route. And if I'm going to present this as the Protestant Reformation, I agree with all of you. I'm going to talk about the decline of the church. I'm going to talk about the decline of the church from medieval Europe into the Renaissance, and give one of these examples that you have outlined, the Great Schism, maybe a little too far back, the corrupt clergy. I might identify like, hey, prior to this point, we're seeing reformers like Jan Hus and John Wycliffe begin to question the church's procedures, things like simony, things like nepotism, the influence of humanism, and people, again, humanists aren't anti-religious, but they are trying to assuage this concept of individual experiences along with the teachings of the church. One of those things, that's where I'm going with my contextualization. So I'm just going to write down my example on here just so that I have it. Let's say that I use, I'm going to use Jan Hus. And we're going to go like this. We want to make sure that we go here and here we go. And we're just going to light Jan Hus on fire. There he is. Okay, Jan Hus is burning. All right, so that's the next part of it. Now, as I set this up, I need to start thinking, okay, what are my examples? Now, here's the key. As you're setting this up, it's not just about examples from the Protestant Reformation. It's examples from the Protestant Reformation that are going to help you to argue that the most essential effect of the printing press is getting information to all people, or whatever I claim I made up on the spot. So the first one, I think very obviously has to be 95 Theses, starting out as this unsettled question, but because of the proliferation of the printing press, this is going to spread this pamphlet far and wide to the point where the Catholic Church needs to speak to it. And the second thing that I would identify here is maybe the Diet of Worms. because the Martin Luther is going to stand outside and he's going to make his speeches and threats, and those things are going to get reported out from there. So those are the two examples that I have to give. When I'm planning this out, I am not going to explain it. However, I am going to make sure that I write down my specific examples, because again, that's a free point. You got to get that point of having two specific examples. You can't just say something along the lines of, well, Protestant reformers were able to spread their messages far and wide. Dude, that is not a historic example. That's not something that I can point to and say, this happened right here in history. So got to be specific. To me, that means in the planning phase, you have to identify those things right then and there. Okay. And then the last thing that I'm really going to identify is CU. Okay, I'm going to make sure that I at least identify that. Even if I can't get to it in the writing of the essay, I'm going to identify it here. So now this one's a little tougher, right? Because we don't really have a flip side of this. It's not a compare and contrast type of question, right? So what can I do to help with complex understanding for this one? Okay, so immediately a couple of things jump to mind. Number one, I might set it apart in my thesis. Although in many places in Eastern Europe, they were still limited by the confines of medieval society, blah, blah, blah. And then I might get into why Eastern Europe, even though the feudal system is starting to be brought down in most of Western Europe and Central Europe, it's still existing in places like modern day Hungary or something like that. I also might discuss, I don't know, something like a different time period. Okay. When I first read this question, the first thing that jumped to mind for me is, remember in your textbook where it says, did the Renaissance actually happen? I might look at something like this and say, okay, well, yes, the most important effect of the printing press is blah, blah, blah. But I might go into how in the Renaissance, we could make the argument that it doesn't necessarily hit all people. It's still mostly hitting middle class. Middle class is not real yet, but middle class and above, as opposed to hitting everybody. So I might discuss that as a way to kind of take the opposing viewpoint. Any other thoughts or ideas on complex understanding, ways that you might take it?
No, you're filling her head with nonsense. You in the history books, I'm telling the truth. Interesting. Yes, thank you. All of history has been whitewashed. Really? What is the real history more?
Yeah, Charlie, what's up?
Okay, I will. I don't know who that
With
is,
this prompt specifically, would you be able to go to one of like the different four things? Because we're kind of talking about religion right now. Would you be able to go like political as well? Would that be a complex understanding?
I think you could. I think you could even argue that while the reason why this is going to affect the most people is because religion is going to have the greatest impact on people's lives. You could even use things like the scientific revolution to say, here's another aspect of society that maybe isn't influenced as much because most people aren't going to have ties to science in their everyday lives, whereas religion does. And then boom, that gives you the ability to talk about Galileo's Il Dialogio or whatever, his dialogues. So yeah, I think you could do that. Could you give a different line of reasoning for complex understanding point? It depends. Remember, the way that this is written as you look at the rubric is you have to show nuance. So it's not just saying, here's another thing. You would have to show, here's how another thing could be looked at as most influential. Does that make sense, Will? So you really have to try and almost undermine your original argument in order to do so. And again, that's what makes this point so difficult. All right, so that's the planning of it. Whoever asked earlier, could you explain how to set up this essay? I'm coming back to this idea here again based on the prompt. If the prompt says the most significant effect, you have to explain how or why your evidence would show that it is the most significant effect. not just an effect, but most significant. And that's where the evaluative piece comes in. Does that kind of make sense to you, whoever said that? You could just type it on the whiteboard if you want.
Relaxing to watch TV can be hard. Actually, watching TV, HBO app. It's easy with Dish. Live TV and streaming apps together.
Another way you could do this is maybe like, as I'm thinking about this, maybe like continuity and change over time aspect. So you could potentially look at this and say that, okay, so yes, religion or the Protestant Reformation is the most significant piece of it, but you could maybe argue that that influence is going to change as the Protestant Reformation moves along, or as the time period moves on from 1450 to 1600. You could make an allusion to, or an analogy to a different time period outside of this time period. That could be an option. I did like how Charlie said, what about one of the other 4 areas, like one of the other 4 themes? I think that's a good move. So you have options. Again, that difficult piece is almost like, show me that you're a smart history student and that you can make a connection beyond just like having a specific answer to this question. How can you show that nuance? That's what that's all about. But for this one, my expectations for you kids, I'm looking at earning the contextualization point, earning the thesis point, setting it up so it's not just a listing of facts, but actually making a coherent historical argument, and then having 2 specific pieces of historic evidence. So for me, you're looking at a 4. Your goal on this should be to earn at least a 4 out of 6. That's what I think. All right. Any other questions about what I've covered so far? I have one more thing I want to go over. Yeah, Charlie, go for it.
How long should we spend on the planning process?
5 minutes. You should be able to do this in 5 minutes because you're not writing full sentences. You're just simply putting things into boxes and thinking. There's nothing to read. There's no DBQ. 5 minutes.
Okay, and then I have one more question. You know how with the DBQ you only have to do 6 documents, but there are 7 given to you? Is there any area in this that you would say is a good idea to pad like that?
If anything, I would make sure you get the example point. So I think that's where, if you do have 2 lines of reasoning or you're trying for complex understanding, just throw another example in there that would help to illustrate some kind of an argument that you're making. Make sure that you get that evidence point, because you have to get that first one to get the using the evidence to make the argument point. And it's free real estate. Like that's free money for you kids. All right. Last thing that I want to cover is setup. What does this look like? Okay. So to me, this is a 4-paragraph essay. I think that that's typically the move. You could even, honestly, you could even make the argument for a 3-paragraph essay for this. So let's say, so paragraph 1 to me is contextualization, context, and thesis statement. And then paragraph 2 is going to be body paragraph 1, your first line of reasoning. But it could also be paragraph 3 if you have 2 lines of reasoning. Does that make sense? I've always said, from an essay writing perspective, if you only have 1 piece of evidence, do you have a separate line of reasoning? So to me, if I'm putting 2 body paragraphs, I'm having 2 examples for each one, even if that means I don't fully get to explain all of them. But I think that, you know, if I'm trying to make you kids better writers, that's what you should be looking for, depending upon your lines of reasoning. And then paragraph 4 is just complex understanding. You're not asked for a closing. It's not, again, these are timed writings. The graders are looking at them as rough copies. Do we have high expectations for you? Of course, but they're rough copies. So you're not going to have some of the fluffiness that's there. What I would love to see, do you kids still have vocab lists from your honors sophomore teachers, like SAT words that you go through throughout the course of the year? Or is that just a Mr. Byko thing? Okay, I'd love to see you trying to use those vocab words from your English classes in your writing. It can be hard at times and feel like you're forcing it, but all of the research shows you do not fully understand or grasp new vocab until you use it on your own 7 times. That's the number. 7 times on your own. So the more that you can get used to trying to use those words in your own writing or in conversation, the better off things will be for you. But to me, this is a 4-paragraph essay. Like Charlie said, if I'm going to pad the stats anywhere, I'm really going to make sure that I have specific historic examples, not a broad description. There were a lot of religious writings from reformers that, like Martin Luther and Jan Hus, that impacted people. That's not enough. You got to have a document. If you don't have the name of the document, if you don't have the name of the meeting, you have to be able to describe it. So for example, if I were writing about, I don't know, the tennis court oath and I couldn't remember the tennis court oath, if I described it as a meeting where the people were locked out and decided not to they decided to continue to meet until they had a constitution, that's enough of a specific description that I'm going to understand what you're talking about. But if you say the meeting where they made the National Assembly, that's not enough. You have to well, maybe I take that back. You have to be specific though in pieces of historic evidence. I think some of you are still struggling with that point, and then you're getting frustrated. Well, why doesn't this count in my SAQs, for example? Well, because it's not a piece of historic evidence. It can't point to where it happened in the history of the world. Okay. Any lingering questions that you have? All right. I'm going to hope that this recording actually works and hopefully post that here tonight. But feel free to share this information with your classmates. Remember, this is meant to be a collaborative affair. If you're in group texts or group chats with other members of the class, don't be afraid to kind of hit them with, hey, here are the couple of big things that Mr. Slim talked about to make sure that you keep in mind, okay? And I know I talked about this last night, but it'll be from within the Unit 3 timeframe, your LEQ. So whatever LEQ you have, it is from within Unit 3. That's between chapters 19, 20, and 21. Obviously, the one that you have may touch on subjects outside of it, but the overall crux of the LEQ will be from this unit. All right, I'm going to call it a night. You kids have a great day again. Sorry I can't be there tomorrow. It's not like I'd be answering questions anyway for this, but yeah, I should be around via email for most of the day. So if you need something, let me know. But other than that, yeah, no problem. My pleasure.